Welcome to the Bunny Chronicles.
I
Let's
love
go.
my hair dark. It looks, I don't know. I just feel like,
100%. No, with your skin and
yeah, with my eyes.
it looks very, just very.
You look gorgeous too. I love that hat.
My hair was wet. It just wasn't, it is what it is, but I'm letting my whites come in. This is mostly turning into my neck. So I'm doing that. I was going to smooth my hair out and roll it.
No.
Old school glamorous Hollywood.
Love your hair curly. I know.
Mama, but
It's always so funny. Anybody that has curly hair.
I know. You hate it.
Yeah. It's like, I would love it.
Relationship, though, I tell everybody that what I love is literally did nothing. Washed my hair and it dries. But I had to put on a hat. But
you look great.
Yeah.
Corinna Harney just joined us. Oh, no, it's too much. It's too much.
It's so overwhelming.
Let's do a cheering now.
It's so overwhelming. Love it. It's amazing.
Okay, so are we stoked or what? Because Corinna, you and I literally spoke about how rad it would be if we were able to talk to the professor or somebody that was in the class. Lo and behold, here we go.
I'm telling you, you can speak things into existence. It's mind blowing. Like when you're thinking of something, and one of the things that Echo and I sat and talked about at length, because it's my passion, was about film. And when we had discovered how much Hugh Hefner had contributed to film preservation and just being such an advocate for film and how he was shaped so much by movies. So anyway, we were talking about his foundation and how there's the USC Hugh M. Hefner moving pictures exhibit.
Yeah, and I can't wait for, let me get to it right here. I have my teleprompter on. This is so dope too. I can't wait to talk about this because this was one of the things that stood out to me. And I had this already marked because I'm always taking copious notes and doing the research. And so I thought this was really, really interesting. So not only was it 3 different donations that have had given, but the final one was the $2 million to the US skiing USC School of Cinematic Arts, which was to fund the central exhibition space. What stood out to me that I can't wait to talk to Rick about was that it's an archival repository that houses decades of student films, production-related records, and other priceless historic resources. Like an installation. There were 3 different endowments that he had given to USC over the span of 20 years. So that's going to be really interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I look, I have Stuart's book and I have the pages marked.
I mean, what a great conversation. Stuart Brotman's book just across the board. And that was also one of my favorite interviews that we conducted. And here we are with another professor. We've had 3 professors on the show, Corinna. Stuart Brotman, the author that wrote Mr. Playboy. Stephen Watts. So Stephen Watts, also professor, and he's the one that spent 5 years at the mansion writing that book.
Hello, Rick Jewell. It's such a pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Rick, let me just say that film is Corinna's arena. She is an actress, a comedian, and just a powerhouse. So she is very, very excited. She's going to pepper you with a lot of questions, and I'm excited to hear what she comes up with. Welcome back to the show, everybody. Miss Corinna and I are beyond excited today. We have a guest that when we first started just kicking around the idea for the podcast, we had spoken about how incredible it would be to get a professor of cinema and media studies at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, which was established from an endowment that Hef had made to USC. With that said, Hef had made a lot of different donations and endowments to USC. And it should be noted for our listening audience that USC is a renowned institution celebrated as a top-tier center for film, television, and interactive media studies. Since its founding in 1929, it offered the first course of study in film at any college or university in the United States, which I thought was really, really interesting, Corinna. I had no idea. In addition to the school having a record-breaking number of endowed chairs in the department and production facilities that rival counterparts, along with an extraordinary faculty and staff. Rick started his tenure at USC in 1976. In 2016, he retired. A couple accolades I want to mention before we get into the conversation. In 2008, Rick Jewell was named an Academy Film Scholar by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. I think that's incredible that you were awarded that by the Academy. Multiple contributions to the field that include acclaimed works, The Golden Age of Hollywood and the RKO Story. And I would highly suggest to our audience that you purchase these books, that you read them, because they are incredible. Hugh Hefner, as you may or may not know for our listening audience, was a long patron of film preservation, and documentary productions. And in 1992, Hefner gave $100,000 to create the Critical Studies course in Censorship in Cinema. And that's what we are going to be speaking to today, censorship in cinema. And what a better time, right? Because just across the board, we're always up against censorship and First Amendment rights. And that is one massive thing that Hef was so passionate about. And so we are here to speak with an expert on it who had a really great affiliation with Hef, and just to talk more to this program. In 1995, Hefner provided another $1.5 million an endowment for the Hugh M. Hefner Chair for the Study of American Film. And again, Hef donated $2 million to the USC School of Cinematic Arts to fund the central exhibition space. A quote from Hef when this endowment was made, I believe it was third and final. He said, "I've always believed that following one's dreams is very important." Hefner said, "I'm proud to support the USC School of Cinematic Arts, which offers dialogue and personal interaction between scholars, educators, industry veterans, and the students who are pursuing their dreams to become the storytellers of the future." Welcome to the show, Rick. We are so honored to have this opportunity to sit down and speak with you. So let's get into it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Echo. It's a pleasure for me to have this opportunity to talk about Mr. Hefner, who was not just a man I admired, but a man that was important in my career, and most importantly, became over the years a good friend of mine.
That's going to be one of my first questions for you, Mr. Jewell, is what were your thoughts on Hugh Hefner and Playboy magazine before you met Hef? And then I'd also like to ask you how you met Hef and how that relationship got started. But first, what were your thoughts? Were you a Playboy reader, or did you have preconceived notions about Hugh Hefner? I know that you also attended USC in 1972. You were initially studying at USC, and what were your intentions then? And then how you got involved again with Hef, and what your thoughts were on him before you met him.
Well, I started teaching first at the University of Florida with a master's degree. I taught humanities classes, and one of my colleagues started a film class. It was the first one that had ever been offered at the University of Florida, and I sat in on the class because I had always been a film nut. I'd always loved movies, and I thought his class was wonderful. Then after that class ended, he came to see me, and he said, "Rick, you have to help me. I have too many students. I can't handle all these students. You have to teach a section of my movie class." And I said, I don't have any real background other than what I learned from your class. He said, "Don't worry about it." He gave me a bunch of books, and he said, "You read these books, you stay a week ahead of the students, you'll be fine." So I loved teaching humanities, but I particularly loved teaching film. And that's when I decided that I wanted to make this my career. And in order to do that, as I said, I only had a master's degree. I knew I'd have to get a PhD. So I started looking around for schools that gave PhDs in cinema. And there were only two at that time. One was NYU in New York, and the other one was USC. And my wife and I decided we were much more interested in going to California than to New York. So off we went. That's how I ended up at USC in 1972. Anyway, to answer your other question, everybody has preconceived ideas about Hefner. There's no question about that. And I had certainly read and enjoyed Playboy over the years before that. And also, I was well aware that he was a major movie fan, as I was, and that he was very happy to have moved from Chicago to Los Angeles, because there he was in the heart of Hollywood and so close to the industry that had given him so much in his life. As he said many, many times, he always told the students in my class this. It was those dreams that he got from watching Depression-era movies in the 1930s especially that caused him to feel that he could do anything. And he ended up doing more than anything, having an incredible career.
Wow. Yes. And 30s specifically during the Depression. I know that in Stuart Rotman's book, he interviewed you about censorship. And I know that there's a time period where was very steeped in, I guess, the Catholic Church, really, that was preventing certain films from being shown. But the 30s, I'm learning so much researching you, by the way, because I didn't even realize that there was a pre-code era, that the things were more risque. And that was probably the 30s when they showed a little more and they kind of let those restrictions go and then they brought them back. I'm saying this right because I know there was a production code called the Hayes Code. William Hayes, he was the RNC chairman. And then in 1927, he called it the don'ts and the be carefuls they had to go by because it was hardly ever enforced. And the people were upset by how risque the nature of Hollywood was in the 30s.
The censorship actually went back to the 20s, to those don'ts and be carefuls. The industry was always under fire from people who were concerned about the impact that movies could have on audience, particularly young audience members. And they were afraid that kids were getting the wrong messages about things in those early movies. And so they were always mounting campaigns against Hollywood. And finally, in 1930, the industry decided they better take this more seriously. And so they came up with something called the Production Code, which was very well thought out and spelled out about the do's and don'ts of what you should put in movies at the time. The big problem was that was just the time when the industry was really hammered by the Depression, when the Depression really got serious and a lot of people were out of work and a lot of people were worried about where their next meal was coming from. So they weren't going to spend it at the box office on movies. Consequently, Hollywood felt that they had to give people more, shall we say, titillating content, stuff that would be more exciting that they hadn't seen before on the screen. And the period, as you mentioned, from 1930 to 1934 has come to be known as the pre-code period. Even though the production code was in place at that time, it's just that nobody was paying any attention to it. And the movies got much sexier. They became much more violent at that time. And people got even more bent out of shape about what these films might be doing to audience members, and again, particularly the younger ones. So in 1934, the industry decided to start policing the production code, forcing the studios to stop being so wild in terms of content and to get them under control before it was too late. What they were most worried about is that the government was actually going to step in, because the Catholic Church, as you mentioned, and other organizations, particularly really bring the hammer down on Hollywood. How I met Hugh Hefner. And that came about in the early 1990s after a colleague of mine died. His name was Arthur Knight. He was a very important man in the history of my school. And he had also been a film critic and had written articles for Playboy. He had done the Sex in the Cinema yearly wrap-up at least 2 or 3 times. And so the new dean at the time, Elizabeth Daly, decided that it would be a great idea if the school could raise some money to give scholarships in Arthur Knight's name, because he had a lot of Hollywood friends. And so she started thinking about possible donors, this scholarship idea. And one of them was Hugh Hefner. Even he wasn't thought of as a film producer, of course, he was thought of as the editor and publisher of Playboy. But he had a relationship with Arthur. So she went to him, along with the head of development in my school, and asked if Hefner would be interested in possibly contributing to this scholarship fund. Well, Hef said he didn't really know Arthur that well, but he knew the school because his elder son had gone to our school for a while and had said good things to his father about the place. And he asked them if we were teaching a course on censorship. Well, interestingly, we had one on the books. It had been taught in the past, but it was not being taught at that particular time. When I say it's on the books, the good news is it's gone through a curriculum committee. You don't have to sell it to all of the chemists and political scientists and others in different departments, and so that they give it their approval for the university catalog. We could just offer it again if we wanted to. And actually, I had a particular interest in that topic, and one of my colleagues did as well. And so we talked, and we both felt we were too busy to do a full course in the subject, but we could get together and co-teach a class where I would teach half the sessions and Drew Casper, my colleague, to teach the other half of them. And we offered this as an idea to Hefner, and he said, great, I'll give you $100,000 if you'll awaken this class and start offering it. And so we said, great, fantastic, we'll go to it. And that's how it all started. He actually decided to have a party at the Playboy Mansion to commemorate the kicking off of this new class. And that's where I actually met him in the flesh for the first time. And that was also a very memorable evening, not just because we got to go to the Playboy Mansion for the first time, but also because we had already decided to ask him if he would come down, given all his battles with censorship over the years, and talk to our students at the end of the semester.
Right.
He would be kind of the thing that we would build the whole course toward. And he seemed a little flattered by the offer, but he said, no, I don't do stuff like that. However, thankfully, Mary O'Connor, his assistant at that time, called me a few days before the party and said, Hef would like a few of the students, no more than 5, to be invited to the party. Well, this presented a terrible problem for me and Drew, because how do you pick the 5? All the rest of them are going to be mad at us for the rest of their lives if they don't get to go to this party. So I actually came up with an idea that worked pretty well. We had just given them a midterm exam, and 3 of them had made A's and 2 of them had made A minuses. And all the other students, there weren't that many in that first class. I would say 20, maybe 25. All the rest of them made lower grades. So we took the 5 ones who made the best grades and asked them if they would like to go to the party. And you can imagine, we got 100% yeses to that. So after Hefner had turned me and Drew down, I rounded up the students and I said, look, you know, you're going to be great heroes to your fellow students who are going to be mad at me and Drew and probably mad at you guys too for getting to go to this party and they didn't get to go. You're going to be great heroes if you can convince Hefner to come to the class so they get to meet him too. And I just had this feeling that it would be much harder for Hefner to say no to them than to me and Drew. So they did what we asked them to do.
You were right.
And I was right. And that was really memorable because Hefner came at the end of that semester. He loved talking to the students. It became important, actually, in his life, and he never missed a class after that for the next 20 years until he just couldn't do it anymore because his health prevented him from coming. And that his yearly, because we only offered this class in the fall semester. It wasn't every semester. It was only in the fall, but
I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
I thought it was every semester.
No, it was just in the fall. His appearance turned that class into one of the most popular classes at the university. It mushroomed at one point. We probably had 140 students in the class.
That was so smart, Rick, that you had the students go up and ask Hef, because that very much represents him as a human being. He would love nothing more than to share his affinity and his advocacy for censorship and First Amendment rights, and then to be able to share that with a collective group of students. It absolutely makes sense that he said yes. So like, that was bravo on your part that you said, why don't you guys go ask him and we'll see what happens? Because ultimately
it also leads me to just, I have to ask this, a film that you and Hef had in common. Is there one that you both loved and that you recall a conversation that you had with Hef about that film specifically?
Well, we have a lot of films in common that we love, but the one that stands out in my mind, because we talked about it over and over again, was Casablanca. He loved that film. I love that film.
It's his favorite.
Yeah, I think it's the most perfect film that's ever been made. I mean, you watch that film and there's never a moment that you say, well, that's not a very good line of dialogue, or that performance is really not up to snuff, or those camera angles are kind of wrong. It's just a perfect movie. And so I think, as I recall, he would have special movie nights at the mansion, and he would call them his Casablanca night.
Yeah. He would do, so it was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday that movies were always shown. And Friday and Saturday leaned towards more of what he wanted to watch. And it was always old school movies, and Casablanca was shown all the time. I mean, I remember many times seeing it up there. And then Sunday night was like new releases where the studios actually brought over a film that had not been out in theaters yet, under lock and key. And then he would preview those movies. But yes, back to his absolute love and affinity of cinema.
Which leads to another question. Of your students, and maybe even the ones that were influenced, because we are obviously honoring Hef with this podcast and exploring and learning more about him. But in your class, are there any students that stand out? Actually, backing up to Macbeth, with Kim Novak and Tony Curtis were in Third Girl from the Left, but with Macbeth, there was something that I wanted to ask you when you brought that up.
Because Hef produced that film, didn't he, Corinna? I have that in my notes, right?
You met him, obviously,
right. He'd already
after
done that at
Macbeth.
that point. And I think Beth had been a little more successful.
Yes,
he might have continued producing movies because he loved them so much.
That was actually 1971. In 1971, Playboy Enterprises for the first time teamed up with Roman Polanski on Macbeth, and it was voted Best Picture of the Year by the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures. And that company also went on to produce Monty Python's first film. And now for something, which I love, Monty Python, something completely different, A Naked Ape with Universal Pictures, and have also produced many movies for television. And then that's why I was bringing that up, the Third Girl from the Left. And that was starring Kim Novak and Tony Curtis. And I know in your classes, I think you did some studies on some of these Billy Wilder films, and like Some Like It Hot that Tony Curtis was in. And those were pretty risque, really, for the time. So good and brilliant.
The good news is that by that time, that film came out, if I remember correctly, 1960. The production code was still in place, but it was falling apart. It had become kind of a joke in Hollywood. Television had come along. The kind of pasteurized was all on TV. So once again, if the Hollywood movies were going to survive, they had to start pushing the edge of the envelope again. And that's that's one of the great comedies of all time, Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot. I think it was 3 or 4 years afterwards, they just scrapped the production code altogether and put in what we have now, the ratings system, which gives people guidance about what they see, but does not censor them.
What year was the rating system implemented? That's interesting.
I think it was 1964, 1963 or 1964.
Again, back to censorship, how it may have, and I never knew this, and these are things that I'm sure were such gold in your class, that Mae West, I'm No Angel, the movie I'm No Angel may have saved Paramount Pictures from ruin.
Really?
PTA, yes, robbed Mae of the very qualities that made her so appealing to the audience, quickly ruining her career. So because she couldn't be Mae West, and she, had many lovers and always, she would come up and see me sometime.
Yeah,
I love Mae West. Censorship resulted in Paramount not being able to make a true Mae West film. So, and then I think it was you that were talking about Howard Hughes, how he maybe was the first anti-studio, basically independent filmmaker. And how really Howard Hughes being a First Amendment advocate and making Scarface first in 1932, directed by Howard Hawks, and then he returned to making films in 1940. Your interview was one of my favorites, obviously, because of film and the history of film. And I'm addicted to Turner Classic Movies. It's a master class in film, really. So it's so exciting that you have such a wealth of knowledge. And back to that, those were your thoughts and things that you had researched and learned.
That's right. I mean, one of the sad stories of the censorship in Hollywood was what happened to Mae West. Indeed, she did show up in the early days of sound. I think her first film was probably 1931. As I said earlier, that was that pre-code era where you could get away with a lot of stuff, and she got away with a lot of stuff. She was so open about the fact that she had many lovers, that she really was into sex, enjoying sex, which was, believe it or not, America was still pretty puritanical at that time, so people were shocked by her persona on the screen. But they were also excited by it. And as you said, she made a huge difference in Paramount. Again, for Paramount, she worked for them. And her films in 1931, 32, and 33, in that pre-code era, were extremely successful. This was a point when Paramount had actually gone into bankruptcy. They were on the edge of going out of business. And those films enabled Paramount to ride out the worst years of the Depression. And then 1934, as I said earlier, the production code started to be enforced, And suddenly, they took away all of the special qualities that Mae West had and, cleaned her up, supposedly. And nobody was interested in Mae West anymore. I mean, she hung in there till about 1940, making occasional movies. But really, she became what was known back then as box office poison. Nobody wanted to see her anymore because the ones who went to see her, they fell in love with the old Mae West, and they weren't going to put up with a Puritanized Mae West. And so, sadly, her career in Hollywood went down the tubes because of that. But that's what censors can do. I mean, they can really destroy people's lives, and they don't care. They think they're doing a great service to mankind at large, and I would have to contend with that idea.
You'd have to contend with
that. Well, we learn, even with history, if we learn from history that we learn nothing from history, right? Well, you have to have the truth, even if it's something ugly, but even if it's with art, if you don't have the truth, the characters, I think we're smarter than that. I think that's going back to how I would love to hear more of that conversation that you had with him, that he knew, he sensed it. He sensed that they were covering something up, and maybe in some way censorship because there's some good that can come out of things, obviously. And maybe that caused a lot of creators and creatives and even visionaries like Hef to say, wait a minute, I'm uncovered. No pun intended.
No pun intended.
What is being covered? You know what I mean? It's interesting, even with art, when you aren't able to completely express. And also, I found it fascinating, something that you had said, Rick, about how it made people more creative.
Right. They made a lot of great movies at that time. Part of the creativity came from trying to suggest things in oblique but interesting ways, often humorous ways, that they couldn't come out and do anymore. There had even been nudity in some of those films in the early 30s. That was absolutely verboten. Plus, of course, all kinds of things that you weren't supposed to touch upon. But the most creative filmmakers during that time, the great writers, directors, producers, found ways to slip in suggestive kinds of things into those films that we look at now and just tickle us to death because we know exactly what they were up to. Probably most of the audience members, they didn't get it, although they were still entertained by these things. They didn't get what the subtext was in those films. But, take a look at Howard Hawks's The Big Sleep, which is a murder mystery, a Philip Marlowe story, and see some of the stuff, the witty dialogue that's in that movie between Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. And they're talking about horse racing and stuff like that, but they're not talking about horse racing.
Yes, it's actually so clever. It makes it so fun. And then it's actually very risque when you read between the lines.
So what you said about puritanical ways, that's so perfect, because that goes directly to Hefner. And that's what he always speaks about the history of how he created the publication and why. And that was to flee his Puritan upbringing and just society as a whole. And what you said earlier about insinuating in the films is what they would have to do. And it was quite comical. That's what Hef did with the publication. So I appreciate you saying the puritanical ways, because that goes line in line with what Hefner was always up against, and ultimately why he established Playboy, the publication that turned into the empire that we know today.
I had so many wonderful students down there. I could throw a bunch of names at you. Whether they actually took the censorship class or not, I couldn't tell you. Because, as I said, I taught a lot of classes. They were big classes, small classes. That class became a very big class. For example, Shonda Rhimes was a student of mine. I know she was in my graduate American film class, but I don't know if she took the censorship class. Maybe she did. Or if she didn't, maybe she showed up for one of the sessions with Hef, because a lot of students would come who weren't even enrolled in our class just because they wanted to see Hugh Hefner and they wanted to hear Hugh Hefner and they wanted to have a chance to ask Hugh Hefner a question. You know, the director and the cinematographer of Wicked, the film that was one of the biggest hits of this year, were both our students down there. I don't know if John Chu was in the censorship class or not. I knew him certainly very well. I just can't remember. And Alice Waters, the cinematographer, might have been in the class too. But when you teach thousands of students, you know, there are some that you never forget. Often they're not the ones who can become the most successful, oddly enough. Anyway, I certainly remember them.
But it's just fascinating, and you must have such pride, you know, and just such what a contribution you've made, and that there are so many artists that were influenced by you and your class. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Shonda Rhimes is one of the best writers of our time, and I just love hearing that. And
I want to ask about, or rather talk about, because I can only imagine, and I believe I shared with you, Rick. So there was one of Hef's security, and Hef's closest friend, Richard Bann, who both said that going to USC and getting the opportunity to have the Q&A with the students was something that he never missed. And as you said earlier, Mary O'Connor had sent you, there was an email at the time, but she had shared with you how important this class was to him and how much he enjoyed being able to attend that. And without fail, of course, anytime that Hugh Hefner would go out anywhere, it was a scene. People wanted to see him. They wanted to, if they had the opportunity, to be able to speak to him, ask questions. But within this construct of a renowned university teaching censorship in cinema, he made the endowment. I mean, of course, so many people that weren't necessarily taking the censorship in cinema were going to show up, because it's like a once in a lifetime opportunity to be able to have that chance to ask him whatever you wanted. And the thing is that, and this is one thing that has really stood out to me over the last 3 years of conducting these interviews and doing the research and watching old interviews with Hef. Absolutely one of his major strengths was the capacity to sit down and have a conversation, an objective conversation, open to all perspectives and all points of view, and willing to have that dialogue. So what an incredible opportunity for him to come to the class. And of course, there was going to be a ton of people that were going to come and show up and, you know, at the very least get to see him, but then be able to have some sort of conversation with him. And, you know, for Hef to be able to speak to his battles that he had to constantly endure with censorship, especially in the early days of Playboy, with the post office and the FBI coming after him. And he was able to draw the parallels between the film censorship battles with customs and the early part of distribution, all the way up to the present time, because it was my understanding that the last censorship committee or whatever you would label it was dismantled in the 90s. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Definitely. There were still, one of the things that happened again in the 1930s, even earlier in some instances, was that different places around the country set up their own censorship boards, they called them. So they had them in Boston, they had them in Chicago, they had them in Dallas, they had them all over the country. And sometimes they had very specific things. If it was in the South, they were very sensitive about black-white relations in films and so forth, would sometimes demand that stuff be cut out of films if they didn't like the way that those relationships were presented. I don't know exactly when it finally died out. I think Dallas was the last place in the country that still had a quote-unquote political censorship board that looked at movies and said, okay, we can release this one. Or
deep in the heart of Texas, I believe.
Getting back to Hefner, listen, you know, it warms my heart that he took such pride and such joy about coming and talking to the students. Because as you said, it wasn't a lecture. He didn't come in and just, start talking for an hour or an hour and a half or something like that. It was always a Q&A. From the very first day he arrived, he said, I'm interested in hearing from you students. You can ask me anything you want. Don't hold back. I'm really interested in what's on your minds, what you think about this subject, what you think about me, and so forth. And that was great. And one of the things that truly impressed me about him was he was a natural teacher. And Drew and I, after a while, we just started calling him the third professor, because we always knew he was going to come. He always came. It was totally dependable. And in fact, Mary called me once and said, Rick, I just want you to know that some people in England wanted to give Hef a special award, but it was going to fall on the day of your class. And he said, no, I can't come. I can't miss my class. That, again, it made us feel so good that he was so involved in everything that he would actually give up an award of some kind that he would have received if he'd flown to London.
Yeah, but that is not surprising at all, because it was so important to him to always fight this battle, and especially for young generations, to educate them or inspire them or whatever you want to call it. So that completely makes sense. And he would be like, I'm not going to go to London and get my award, because I got my class at USC and I'm accountable to my students. Yeah. And it's the one time I'm going to get to see them at the end of semester. I mean, that's so cool. That's amazing.
It was great. It was a match made in heaven. It was a subject that he loved, dealing with another subject that he loved, and that is censorship, dealing with movies. And it also had been so important in his life because he had been on the front lines fighting the battle with the censors, from the Postal Service to the, like 7-Eleven that wouldn't put his magazines on the newsstands anymore and things like that. Yeah. It was and it made a difference to the students, not just because he was a famous guy coming to their class. It was because they understood what he had gone through with censorship. Going back to he understood. He was so smart. He understood even when he was watching those films in the piece that something had changed in 1934, that the movies that had come before were different and much more, shall we say, open and realistic in a sense than the films that came afterwards. Even though he loved those films, he loved those musicals and so forth from that time. But he knew that something was different. And then when he was a little older, he started researching it himself and finding out why that had happened.
Don't ever get him into, or was he already exploring foreign films, some of those Japanese films and French films that were more avant-garde, and that even there was some Swedish films that were very, they showed just more realism and with exploring different sides of humanity that were more real and more. Do you remember if there was a foreign film that he loved? I know we're just talking about America and censorship here, but that's a question I just would love to ask.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because those films had a lot to do. I talked earlier about the end of the production code era and the start of the rating system that we still have today. And that came about in the 1960s, and that was the time of the so-called art film renaissance in Europe and Japan and places like that, which a lot of people started going to see those films because they were much more realistic in a way, much more interesting in terms of, especially in terms of sexuality, than American films had been able to be up to that point. And that had an impact on the Hollywood industry, and it became then more open about those kinds of subjects. But yes, students, particularly in the first years when Hef started coming, they were pretty knowledgeable by that time about the whole kind of arc of film history and how important those foreign films were, not just in opening up people to the idea that film could be an art form, but also opening up people to subject matter that they hadn't been able to see on screens before, and causing Hollywood to say, hey, we better get on this bandwagon before we get left behind. So it changed the films from, Brigitte Bardot in France. They weren't great films, but they were much more than most films had been up to that point. A lot of Italian films, Fellini, Antonioni, those films, French New Wave pictures, Truffaut, Godard, pictures like that. And then the Japanese films, Kurosawa was a particular favorite of mine, and I know of Hef's too, and others from Japan that were ahead of the game at that point.
You think this helped shape Hef in being such an advocate for our military, which he really was. He was such a proponent, and women could be an inspiration to men and our war fighters. And I know he was part of Operation Playmate. And I remember writing letters during the Gulf War to soldiers, and they were encouraged. But it's so interesting to me, going back to how the Nazi government pulled the plug on American movies in the early 80s because of movies like Confession of a Nazi Spy. And one of my favorite, I think as a little girl, I saw The Great Dictator, and I just always loved Charlie Chaplin.
Right.
But in your Stuart Brotman interview, back to Stuart, you said that when you were doing your RKO research, you discovered George Stevens wanted to make an anti-fascist picture in 1939, but the president of RKO vetoed the idea. And the studio chief said that he's just afraid to commit to a picture that is propaganda against anything. And then in World War II, opposite happened. When World War II, we were deep, on two fronts with Japan and Germany. Then the government did get involved with movies for the first time. The OWI, the Office of War, movies became a great crusade against our enemies. And the President Roosevelt believed movies could help America win the war. And I love that you in detail know that history that a lot of people don't even realize.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Good one, Corinna.
Right. That it's really interesting.
That was all.
America in the late 30s was an isolationist country, in the sense that most people in the country were afraid that another war was going to break out, and they were unhappy about our participation in World War I. And so the definite tone of the population at that time was, we're not going to send our boys over to Europe to die like we did in the 19-teens in World War I ever again. So most of the people who ran studios in Hollywood at that time decided they could not make anti-fascist, anti-Nazi movies because they were afraid that the audiences would react badly to those films. And they were afraid that the people running the studios were afraid that they would be looked upon as trying to maneuver us back into a terrible war. The only studio that was different was Warner Brothers. Most of the studios were run by Jews at that time, but the Warner Brothers were the only ones who stood up and said, these Nazis are just the lowest of the low, and we're not going to distribute our films in Germany anymore, starting in 1936. All the other studios, even after World War II broke out in September of 1939, wanted to keep making money from Germany, so they kept sending their films over there. As soon as it became clear that we were going to get involved, the Germans said, no more, we're not going to import any more of your films. And then they felt more able to make those anti-Nazi films that you talked about. And then when we were involved in the war, Roosevelt, the entire government felt that Hollywood could really help the war effort by making films that not just were against the enemy, but also celebrated our country, our political system, and of course our soldiers. They made any number of war pictures in which our soldiers were the big heroes during that time. And who knows exactly how much it helped us win the war, but it must have helped us in certain ways.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, Corinna. I didn't read that bit about Eisenhower saying that and because it was for morale, right?
Roosevelt, yeah. No,
not Eisenhower, Roosevelt. Yeah,
yeah.
Roosevelt.
And it's incredible how
Roosevelt.
how movies do shape. I think really, if you look at how much movies can influence, Hef was always a romantic, and one of the things he always would harken back to, and why he loved all of those movies in the 30s, there was a romance and the golden era. Your book that you wrote, Rick, the golden era of cinema. I sadly, shame on me. I didn't get to read it before you, but it's on its way, and I'm going to be reading that. Maybe we'll have you back on so we can ask you questions that are in that book. But one of the films I just saw on TCM, again, watched it 3 times.
Oh, yes. I love it. Yeah.
Wait to read it. But one of the things that they wouldn't touch on that's fascinating to me, and I don't know if this is in your book, but how, they never understood what PTSD was. And a lot of these men coming back from World War I and then World War II, they just called it shell shock. But the only movie that ever touched on it, and it's one of my favorite movies, I cry every time I watch it, The Best Years of Our Lives. Every single time, without fail, their performances, because one of them is a deputy in real life, and he wasn't an actor. It was really him portraying him. And they had never done that before. And they had never touched on the soldier coming home. And it's more from the humanities side, not the war heroes side, not the battlefield side, but the after effects of having to assimilate back into society. It's a timeless movie. And it's one of my favorites. We have it in our collection. And it just shows what a soldier goes through and what his family goes through. And it's so, I mean, I don't know what you think of that movie, but I thought how incredible, just the history of film, but you can go back, and because they removed a lot of that censorship at the time, that was something they had a really hard time, but they still put the parents in opposite beds,
Yeah, that's always my favorite. The 2 twin beds all the way up until the 50s on TV.
That was one of the oddities, I think, because they were separate beds. You don't sleep in the same bed. That's
just a little piece of trivia about that. The twin beds were not actually in the production code. The reason that they started doing that is that Great Britain was the biggest market outside the United States for American movies. They were even more squeamish than we were, and they insisted that married couples had to have twin beds, not double beds. So it was an accommodation to the Brits, not actually part of the production code itself. And then when television came along, they just went right over the twin beds.
Whoa, that is so interesting, Corinna. Like, who knew? It was the Brits.
Yeah.
And then it went all the way up into the piece on American television. That is wild. I love it. Another factoid we just pulled out. The British are coming. So, Rick, I want you to touch on, because I thought this was really interesting. And so you said that there were obviously a big group of people that would always show up, and it was peppered with feminists originally, because of course it's Hugh Hefner. He's controversial. It's Playboy magazine. And so tell us a little bit about what that looked like and how Hef handled that. And then it kind of just fell to the wayside eventually, and people were there to ask about film, right?
Yes, absolutely. I want to plug Stewart's book too. It's a terrific book about First Amendment rights, and I'm very honored to be part of it. So those of you who are watching or listening to this, I recommend it highly. Anyway, I'm glad you brought that up, Echo, because yes, the early days of Hef's appearances were interesting, perhaps more interesting than they became later on, because that was kind of a very hot period in the development of feminism in the country, and particularly on college campuses. And as Hef always said, I mentioned this earlier, he wanted people to ask him questions about anything, not to hold back. If they were unhappy with him for any reason, tell him why. He would like to have a chance to have a conversation about his life and what he's done. He understood he was controversial. So particularly in those early days, we had I wouldn't call them hardcore feminists. They were just trying to learn about women's liberation and so forth at that time and to get some sense of it. They certainly knew that Gloria Steinem and others had taken Hef to task for exploiting women, and they wondered what he had to say about that. And he had, I think, not expected this, not in the class, because he had already faced this on various talk shows and things like that from people who wanted to criticize him for what he had done. And at first, I think he was taken aback because he felt that he was very useful in the development of the liberation, the taking of women more seriously, the equality issues related to women. He thought he had actually contributed to that because he had been in favor of abortion from early on and subjects, women's right to decide what they do with their bodies. But he was well prepared to deal with the questions when my students got around to asking him those sorts of questions. And he was so articulate. I mean, people, I think, who didn't know him didn't know how brilliant a man he was and how he could really make a case. He could argue a case. That's a lot of teaching is that too. And that's why I said we looked upon him as being the third professor in our class. But getting back to that, I don't know after he finished explaining the things that he had done, not just for women's rights, but for civil rights and other areas that are so important during that period in the development of the country. I think maybe they didn't buy it 100%, but I think they were impressed by the thought that he had put behind all of the decisions that he had made, what he published in Playboy and so forth. There was great writing in Playboy, great literature, great nonfiction.
That's actually such a good point, is that when people had the opportunity to really command Hef's attention and have a dialogue with him, you're always blown away, really impressed. That man was brilliant. And there's nobody like him. There'll never be another Hugh Hefner. People would walk away with a whole other understanding and a level of respect for the man. You may or may not agree with what he did, but at the end of the day, he would welcome conversation and a dialogue, because at the end of the day, that's what Playboy and the journalism and all the articles, it was objective journalism, and that's what he was. He was objective, and there's just not enough of that in today's world, period. Certainly not in media, as we know. And so not surprising that the takeaway would be, oh my God, what a brilliant man, and just a little better understanding of the decisions that he made and why he did the things he did and what he had to go through. Whole other level of respect was made at that point.
I always called him a walking history book. Really, could ask him about things, and really he's a time vault.
No question.
And with some of the most prolific people. And he was, really one of those that was a gentleman. I think we've discussed before, even if there were people that didn't agree or thought that it wasn't morally up there. He never criticized those people. He always left the table open. And Echo and I are finding more and more as we're doing this podcast how incredible that is, and how, I mean, he created an empire from a vision, but had to fight censorship to do it. But something interesting, because you still have these forces, on both sides. I guess you would say, I don't know if you'd say it's a side, but you have people that slander people. And I won't go into it in detail, but I'll just be kind of hypothetical. There are people that will try to tear him down and maybe have said things.
Wait, do you mean Holly Madison?
That stop. Well, because the sad thing is he was a gentleman. He wouldn't he wouldn't kiss and tell. He was a self-proclaimed playboy. So that's what he was. We all knew what he was. He didn't try to hide it. He wasn't a wolf in sheep's clothing. He said, I am the original playboy. Now, it's not a lifestyle most people would choose. And I would love to ask him, but we can't now. if he thinks that it maybe was to, his detriment at the end of his life. But that said, you had people that did the opposite of what he wanted for his brand. In other words, he wouldn't kiss and tell. Even though he would expose things in the bedroom, in the magazine, or be more open, it was never, as odd as this is, it just never seemed dirty. And maybe I'm just naive. I just never saw that. And I think he tried to keep it, especially when he was competing with Penthouse at one point. Really, the more the girl next door, I think it's sad that, anybody would kiss and tell when he would to them. I don't know what made me think of that, but
no, I couldn't agree with you more. As I told Echo the other day, when I watched that series, that documentary series about him, when a lot of his favorites in the past kind of
the dark secrets of Playboy,
and I thought, God, that's so low. When people have asked me about that, I have one standard line that I use. I say, that's not the Hugh Hefner I knew. That's all I know. I wasn't out there every night or anything else, but I got to know him pretty well. And that's just not the man I know.
Exactly. And I think that's like the perfect way to leave it when anybody asks any of us that are affiliated with Playboy and Hugh Hefner, especially knowing him on a personal level. And it's just like right away, people jump to it and go, oh, well, it has to be true because of who he was and how controversial he was. And it's like, okay, well, why don't you take a good look at who's saying that and what are the reasons surrounding it of why it's being said? Right to his widow, if we'll call her that, Crystal Hefner, who just published that salacious book and just, again,
lives on, here we go. I guess
yeah,
First Amendment to lie, that's the sad part.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's
irresponsible.
Yeah, irresponsible. Exactly. Highly irresponsible. There's no factual basis whatsoever. It can be argued with the people that were there 24/7 at the mansion that had day-to-day interactions with Hef and with these women. I'll just say this. I'm just so grateful that we have this platform. Brian Olea and Victoria Fuller also have their podcast. And we're here to set the record straight. People are going to take that with a grain of salt. But at the end of the day, it's like, we were there. We were a part of it. We knew him. We knew the inner workings of the company, of the magazine, of what our experience was. None of us had that experience. None of us. And so it's just like, okay, so there's like 3 women that had this experience and how many playmates over, 60 years? Plus the 24/7 staff that were there for decades. And this is interesting too, Rick, that you would appreciate. Of everybody that we have interviewed on the show, nobody was there for a period of a couple of years. People were there for decades and decades. And that speaks volumes to Hugh Hefner. they wouldn't stay there if all this stuff was going on. It just wouldn't, nor would the magazine had maintained its relevance and its popularity if this kind of stuff was going on. It would have been shut down a long time ago.
Well, he had, we've said this before, a certain honor and just character, and you can't.
Integrity.
Yeah, so he speaks for himself in that.
Yeah,
so
right.
It's fun to hear your recollection and the decades that he was there faithfully to be part of that class and the third professor.
We have to start calling him the third professor.
Yeah. That's so wonderful having you, Rick, and hearing all of your insight with the history of film, and that you shared that love with Hef. I read somewhere also that you wished you had recorded all of his Q&As and having him in the classroom.
I was just going to say, when you're dealing with somebody like that and they become part of your life, and you know that you'll see him more than once a year because he invited us to the parties too, but you know that one day he's going to be there, you think it's going to last forever. And that's stupid, because what I should have done was take at least some of those sessions. If I just had one of the early sessions, one about 5-6 years later, another one 5 or 6 years later, and then one toward the end, I would treasure those. I would just treasure them. But, oh well, 20/20 hindsight, as they say.
But you respected his privacy as he respected people's privacy. He was a very open person, but he was a very private person.
Do you recall, because everywhere that Hef went, of course, he had his security. He always had cameras around him because they had staff photographers, right? Because everything was documented in his life. As you know, he was a avid scrapbooker from the time he was a child all the way till the end of his life. So do you recall if there were cameras there with him? Because I would imagine that there's got to be something like that in the archives.
There were still cameras. His personal photographer, Elaine, was always there. And in fact, I have a bunch of photos that she sent me over the years, because he would go to lunch with us after the session too. And she would always make sure she got a group shot of all of us together. And there were video cameras there on a couple of occasions, because people did documentaries about him, as you know. And they would send photographers, and we'd always say, of course, come on in. So there is footage. A lady, I can't remember her name, from Canada did one of the last documentaries about him. There's a nice segment in our class in that, and there's an earlier documentary. I can't remember who did that one. One of the earliest classes, because it was still a small class when he was speaking to it. Unfortunately, at least in those documentaries, it's maybe a minute's worth at most is all. But God, I wish I had all that footage.
Was it Playboy activist and rebel?
That is her. She's from Canada. That is the...
Yes. I think that's the one. I think it...
That was a powerhouse doc, and I think really well-rounded and conveying who Hugh Hefner was and capturing all the elements. Okay, so we always like to end the show with 2 questions, and it's probably my favorite part of the show, maybe Corinna's too, because everybody has different answers, but they resonate the same. So the first question for you, Rick, is 3 words that define Hugh Hefner to you.
That's easy enough. First of all, brilliant. Secondly, generous. Thirdly, down to earth. No affectation whatsoever.
Down to earth. That's so cool. I love that. Okay, so second question. Had you had the opportunity to say anything to Hef before he passed or in memoriam, what would you say?
I would have just said, I can't thank you enough for everything you did for my school and for me personally. I was privileged, and I say this word with an underline. I was privileged to hold the Hugh M. Hefner Chair for the Study of American Film for the last approximately 17 years of my life, of my career, to hold that chair, to be the initial holder of the Hugh M. Hefner Chair for the Study of American Cinema.
Yeah, I love it. You know, that's the common response to the second question is just thank you. Thank you for taking me on this journey. Thank you for including me as a part of all of this. And it's just, yeah, we are just so blessed, truly, for the people that had the opportunity to be a part of it, to know Hugh Hefner, to have a friendship with him, a mentorship, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, we're all so very blessed to have had that moment in time. And none of us will ever forget it. And we're better people because of it, I would say.
Right. Well, thank you for allowing me to express my gratitude to him.
Thank you, Rick.
Because he definitely made an intervention in my life
Yeah.
that I appreciate.
It was my favorite because we got to touch on some film history, and I mean, a tiny bit, but so fun to talk to a master.
Absolutely. We manifested it and it happened and you are here. So a few words to our audience before we say au revoir and farewell. If you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, what are you waiting for? Make sure that you do. We have so many incredible interviews, long format, and it runs the spectrum from everything from Playboy corporate to professors such as yourself. You're our third professor we've had on the show, Playboy Mansion staff, all of it. So if you have not, subscribe, like, share, follow. All of our social media handles are Bunny Chronicles Podcast. Please make sure you're following us there. And we will see you next week for our next show. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Lovely to talk to you.
Okay.
both.
Thank you so much, Rick.